Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of TDNY, This Day, Not Year, the podcast where I, Adam, and myself, Adam, take a look at the history of the week ahead and just for the heck of it, also suggest a fitting song after each story. A kind of double feature where I get to explore some interesting history and trivia and also get to expose? That sounds bad too. Expand. That's better. Expand your music horizons with some of my personal tastes along the way. So, with the introduction done, let's have a quick look at what we'll be learning today. On this episode, we discover why you should duck when this former president is at the tea, the time Russian scientists flashed Europe, what the first MCU movie actually was, when the devil went down to Devon, and a whole lot more along the way. So, let's get started. But before we get to this Monday, February 3rd story, let's take a quick look back at a more recent event. Donald Trump is estimated to have played a round of golf every 5.6 days during his first swing at being president of the United States of America. Or basically one game of golf a week. Just a week after being sworn in a second time, and there was swearing, believe me, after telling reporters, who asked if he would be playing any golf, "No, I don't think so. I'm busy," Trump was seen, you guessed it, playing golf. What relevance does this little anecdote have to our TDNY episode? I'm glad you asked. On this day, not year, back on February 3rd, another past president was playing a round of golf, but maybe doing more harm than good. Once more, we turn to the Canberra Times for this story from 1980. Former US President Gerald Ford tried his best for a good shot in front of the national television cameras while playing golf yesterday, but instead he hit a spectator. Mr. Ford and the show business celebrities were taking part in the Bing Crosby National Pro-Am Golf Tournament at Pebble Beach. His fourth shot on the second hole struck a male spectator and cut his head. This, as it turns out, wasn't a once-off for the 38th President of the US, Gerald Ford. On June 24th, 1974, a 17-year-old male spectator was struck by an errant Ford-hit ball and rushed to hospital. Shortly after, a policeman in a golf cart also fell victim to Ford's form. An earlier game from the same year had seen Ford tee off, slice a ball over a fence, and right into a public swimming pool full of children, thankfully missing them all. February 4th, 1984. The 15th hole of the Spyglass Hill golf course. A woman was struck on the temple, requiring a stitch, when his ball swerved into the spectators. Everyone else managed to duck in time. February 15th, 1995. Ford, playing with Bill Clinton and George Bush Sr., struck another spectator. Bush hit two, while Clinton only knocked a piece of watermelon out of a young spectator's hand. There's even an apocryphal story of Ford, at a Scottish tournament in 1973, teeing into the crowd and striking a World War II veteran, before giving him the ball as an apology. Unfortunately, I can't find any verifiable proof this happened, but it does track with his reputation. It was mishaps like these that caused comedian and golfer Bob Hope to quip, "It's not hard to find Jerry Ford on a golf course. You just follow the wounded." Hope was also known to don a helmet when playing with Ford. Although portrayed in media, including Saturday Night Live and The Simpsons, as a clumsy and bumbling individual after he tripped down a flight of stairs coming off an airplane, in reality Ford was quite an athletic person. Just one who didn't have the straightest golf game. Fortunately, even after all of this, Gerald Ford had a good sense of humour about his peculiar set of golfing skills, joking, "Back on my home course in Grand Rapids, Michigan, they don't yell 'four,' they yell 'Ford.'" Well, That was a fairly light-hearted start for a TDNY episode and for the week ahead. So before we get to the song pairing for this story, let's end this day with some more presidential golf facts. The first president to publicly swing the iron was William Taft, president between 1913 to 1921. Prior presidents played, but did so privately, with the belief that golf was a game for the rich and may tarnish their image among citizens. Between Taft's tenure up to Trump's second term, every president has hit the green, or at least been a golfer. Well, nearly every president. Only 3 during that time abstained from golf: Jimmy Carter, Harry Truman, and Herbert Hoover. Now, a song to fit this particularly striking story. It may not be an original choice, it may not be a clever choice, but it sure is a fitting choice. The 1980 Pat Benatar pop anthem, Hit Me With Your Best Shot. And a little side fact too, apparently Benatar stopped performing this song in 2022 as a protest against the frequent mass shootings that occur in America. Although her current tour website does state, "There's plenty of chances to hear songs like We Belong, Love is a Battlefield, and Hit Me With Your Best Shot." So perhaps the protest is over? Moving along to Tuesday, February 4th. And on this day, not year, Russian scientists flashed Europe. But blink and you'd miss it, as the flash travelled 8 kilometers per second. Just what am I talking about? Znamya, which translates from Russian to banner in English. Znamya, well specifically Znamya 2, was a 20-meter wide plastic aluminum mirror that in 1993 unfurled and reflected down a 5-kilometer wide patch of light no brighter than a full moon across Europe. Perhaps it's more appropriate to say Russian scientists mooned Europe. With the Soviet Union on the brink of collapse in the late 1980s, they didn't have the desire to fund the solar sail concept presented by scientist Vladimir Siromyatnikov. But when he pivoted the idea into a space mirror that could potentially send down sunlight anywhere on the planet, areas such as the Arctic Circle, with their yearly patches of permanent night, the Soviet Union were interested. This wasn't a new idea, with German scientist Hermann Oberth first publishing the concept in the 1920s, but this would be the first practical test of it. Europe was warned the test was to go ahead, and people woke up early in the hopes of seeing the mirrored light traverse the continent. Unfortunately for much of the test area, heavy clouds obscured any light, but those in Toulouse, France got a perfect view. Local Joël Mathurin said of the test, "I was up and outside my house on purpose, and it was exactly on time. It was very impressive. 2 bright spots close together, passing through the sky, coming from the Pyrenees and heading northward." I'm sorry. Another eyewitness, Claude Pichard, said, "It was 6:23 exactly, like the CNES, the French Space Agency, had said, when I saw 2 points of the mirror. A number of us had gathered specifically on the main square. Since the sky was clear, we saw it throughout its trajectory. It looked like 2 luminous diamonds following one another across the sky from the south and heading northwest. It looked like it was moving faster than the speed planes fly at when in high altitude." Astronauts aboard the Mir space station were able to track the circle of light across the surface of the planets and the clouds too. Shortly after, Znamya's orbit was allowed to decay and the mirror burn up as it re-entered the atmosphere. Znamya 2.5 went into production, 25 meters wide, predicted to produce a 7-kilometer wide spot of reflected light between 5 to 10 full moons bright. It was sent up, ready for testing, but unfortunately it hit a major and literal snag as it attempted to unfurl, getting caught up on a nearby antenna before breaking apart. Despite the successful test of the 2, the failure of 2.5 proved too great and the project was shut down. And this would have been the final chapter of the space mirror idea, except for in 2024, a little startup called Reflect Orbital was founded. Basically following the same method as Vladimir Suromyatnikov, Reflect Orbital planned to take the concept a step further and rent out reflected sunlight in 4-minute and 5-kilometer chunks. This rented sunlight then falls into two categories: lighting and energy. Lighting, much like the Znamya plan, would be used to provide extra light to areas that may require it, whereas energy is to provide light to solar farms at night. In theory, this is a good idea, but in practice, and according to a lot of skeptical scientists, this is far from perfect. Imagine, if you will, that you need to water a plant, our solar farm stand-in for this thought experiment, using a hose, i.e. the sun. You can deliver a lot of water, or sunlight, quite quickly onto the area you need. But if you attach, say, a cone spray nozzle onto the hose, which will act as our mirror, suddenly the direct water is spread out over a much larger area, which may cover more of what you are trying to water, but will also get less directed water or sunlight. So, while Reflect Orbital may be able to direct a timed quantity of sunlight at night over a solar farm, it will be greatly lessened and the solar energy more dispersed than direct sunlight, making any gained energy marginal against the cost to Reflect Orbital for the sunlight. Still, applications for these spots have all filled and testing is said to go ahead in Q4 of this year, 2025, so maybe I'll be pleasantly surprised by how it all works, and poor Vladimir Suromyatnikov, who passed away in 2006, will finally get his moment in the sun again. I think the perfect song pairing for this story is another obvious one, and I say it's alright. Here Comes the Sun by the Beatles. Today, the MCU is one of the most successful film franchises to exist, as of 2025 owning over $31 billion at the box office, and it would take you over 3 days of non-stop watching to watch all the movies back to back. Did you know, for our Wednesday, February 5th entry, that on this day, not year, the first Marvel movie came out? Well, to be fair, it wasn't technically even Marvel yet. Starting up in 1939, the comics were published under Timely Publications as Timely Comics, although their first published comic was Marvel Comics #1, and even then they were occasionally published through a shell company as Marvel Comics. So, in fact, it's kind of hard to say these weren't Marvel Comics from the very beginning, although the official name change came in the 1960s, rebranding them to Marvel Comics. Some of the earliest Marvel/Timely comic heroes were Super Rabbit, a pre-Bugs Bunny anthropomorphic rabbit with the powers of flight and invulnerability. The Whizzer, who, after a transfusion of mongoose blood, gained super speed. Ziggy Pig and Silly Seal, created because, to quote creator Al Jaffe, "I've never seen anyone do anything about a seal," while Stan Lee chimed in, "Why don't you give him a little friend of some sort?" And of course, Captain America. Patriotic, strong, and most importantly willing to stand up for what was right, even in the face of ultimate evil. Captain America embodied all that America wished and wanted to represent. With his shield in hand, Steve Rogers, aka Captain America, battled against Adolf Hitler and his Nazi army. The character was met with instant success, so perhaps it should come as no surprise that in 1944 it was Captain America that was turned into the first Marvel movie. That's Marvel comic movie, as Captain Marvel was already the first comic movie starting in 1941. Of course, Captain Marvel of that time was a Fawcett comic character, not Marvel or Timely Comics, but did later join the Detective Comic roster, but with a name change from Marvel to Shazam. Meanwhile, Captain Marvel was introduced as a new character for Marvel Comics after, but had nothing to do with the original Captain Marvel. Now, besides being very confused, where was I? Oh yes, the Captain America movie. Captain America, a Republic serial, followed the adventures of Grant Gardner, a slightly overweight district attorney by day, as he becomes the gun-toting, masked crime fighter Captain America by night. The movie serial told the story of his battles with his nemesis, the Scarab, an evil museum curator out to steal the powerful dynamic vibrator from Professor Lyman. "How did you find out about my vibrator?" the professor would shout when confronted. "Wait a minute," you might be thinking, once you stop your titters over dynamic vibrator. "This doesn't sound like Captain America," and you may well be right. There are some who believe the script was originally written for a different character, either the Copperhead or Mr. Scarlet, but the studio had a failed bid for the character's rights and had to quickly pivot production to be around another hero, Captain America. While something like rights to the character may have been a big obstacle for the Hollywood cinema of America, overseas, like in Turkey, such limitations weren't even considered. A later worldwide release of the Captain America movie series had seen the character gain a fan base in Turkey before a comic was even released there. This led to the 1973 movie Three Dev Adam, or Three Giant Men, although it also goes by another name, Captain America and Santo vs. Spider-Man. A ridiculous movie, shot on a low budget, full of stolen assets and characters, shoddy special effects, and nonsensical plot points. Normally, all would be reasons to avoid a movie, but in this case, the reasons it has become a cult classic. This is part of a subgenre known as Turksploitation. As per Wikipedia, Turkish low-budget exploitation films that are either remakes of or use unauthorized footage from popular foreign films and television series. If this sounds interesting, I thoroughly recommend tracking down 3 Dev Adam and giving it a quick watch. I can also suggest Dunyani Kurtaran Adam, or The Man Who Saved the World, very loosely based around Star Wars, featuring scenes stolen directly from the movie, music stolen from Indiana Jones and Flash Gordon, and a very creative use of off-screen trampolines to showcase the jump height of a main character. Now then, how do we recap a story such as this with a song? We have the first Marvel comic movie, even if it wasn't based on the comic character, and a Turkish film that has done the same thing. Ah, got it. All Summer Long by Kid Rock. A song that, whenever I hear it start, tricks me into thinking it's going to be Werewolves of London by Warren Zevon. Just like these movies trick the audience by using the name and likeness of an existing character. For our Thursday, February 6th story, we jump from one story of imposters to another. But first we have to go a little further back in time. It was 1918, and the Russian royal family, the Romanovs, had been under house arrest, bounced from location to location by the Bolshevik revolutionaries. Although locked down, they were at first allowed a lot of freedoms within their confines, although each subsequent location became sparser and sparser, with harsher conditions imposed by their guards. The family consisted of Tsar Nicholas II and his wife Alexandra Fyodorovna, plus their 5 children Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei. Despite hopes of political exile to England, on the night of July 17, 1918, those hopes would be cruelly dashed. Counter-revolutionaries were closing in on the Bolshevik stronghold of Yekaterinburg, and rather than risk the deposed Tsar being rescued and becoming a figurehead, they figured it was better he became the disposed Tsar. So, nearing midnight on the 17th, the family were awoken, told to dress, then ordered into the basement of a palliative house where they had been confined. Their fate was announced to them. Nikolai, in view of the fact that your relatives are continuing their attack on Soviet Russia, the Ural Executive Committee has decided to execute you. And just like that, 300 years of House Romanov rule came to an end. Until 1920. A young woman is saved from a suspected suicide attempt in a canal in Berlin. Taken to a hospital, she had no identification, and so was simply referred to as Miss Unknown. It wasn't long until she was sent to the Daldorf Asylum, still under the pseudonym of Unknown. For 2 years there, she kept to herself, although there was something about Miss Unknown that gave people pause. Was it the way she conducted herself? Something in her appearance? Or maybe just her stoicism? Regardless, rumors started spreading that she was royalty, maybe even Grand Duchess Anastasia herself, having survived the execution room 2 years prior, and now living with amnesia in an asylum. After all, it wasn't impossible for one of the Romanovs to have survived a firing squad. They all had jewels sewn into their clothing, hidden in hopes of a little nest egg on their escape or release, but also an effective makeshift bulletproof vest. So, Miss Unknown was investigated, but those who believed her to be Anastasia continued to grow. This was only bolstered by old friends of Anastasia, who on meeting Miss Unknown claimed she was, without a doubt, Anastasia. Changing from Miss Unknown to Anastasia Tchaikovsky, and eventually Anna Anderson, she bounced around Europe for the next few years, from supporter to supporter, slowly wearing out her welcome before moving on to the next person believing her to be Anastasia. Then, it was on this day in 1928 when Anna Anderson arrived in New York, at the request and expense of a distant relative to Anastasia, claiming she was visiting a specialist to have her jaw reset after it had been broken on the bloody night of 1918. Here, Anna attempted to start legal motions to inherit all assets that Tsar Nicholas held outside of Russia. The attempt would end in failure, but she would gain another lifelong believer in Gleb Botkin, son of the Romanov family doctor, who claimed to recognize her instantly. For the next 56 years, Anna Anderson would continue to drift between supporter and asylum, eventually marrying a believer in 1968, before passing away in 1984. During all that time, she had fervent believers among old friends and family of Anastasia, as well as relatives who doubted the entire story. But with her death, no one would ever know for sure. Until 1979, when amateur sleuths would uncover the makeshift grave that held the bodies of Nicholas II, his wife, and 3 of their daughters. DNA testing in 1994 would prove their identity, leaving a second daughter and son unaccounted for. So, maybe Anna Anderson had been telling the truth all along. No one would ever know for sure. Until 2007, when the final 2 missing bodies would be discovered, tested, and proven to be the final missing daughter and the son Alexei. So, who then was Miss Unknown, the woman who had lived as Anastasia for most of her life? Well, a 1927 investigation by Anastasia's uncle, Ernest Louis, or Ernest Louise, unsure which, had identified Miss Unknown as Franziska Szkłonskowska, born in 1896. Supposedly, during World War I, she had worked in a Polish munitions factory, whereupon shortly after receiving word that her fiancé had been killed, an accident in the factory would have her drop a live grenade, accidentally killing a foreman and injuring herself in the process. This shock and injury saw her declared insane and sent to an asylum, where eventually she would vanish from during 1920, never to be seen as Franziska again. A rather sad tale. One family destroyed by revolution, and one woman's life destroyed by war, seeking escape in the lie she was a different person, a fictional survivor from a royal family she'd probably only ever heard stories about. The perfect song to sum up this story is also probably a question that Anna Anderson was asked repeatedly over her 64-year stint as Anastasia. Who are you? By The Who. Onwards to Friday, February 7th. It's probably not an overstatement to say that at one stage or another, those who drink have indulged a little too much and done something they've regretted. Whether that regret is doing something stupid in public, or perhaps a private message. Either case, it's safe to say that regret wasn't as historical as today's story. Meet Irishman William Lloyd, when on this day, not year, after a week of heavy drinking, decided a trip to the British Museum was called for. Nobody knows why he took the following actions. William seemingly dipped from the history books after. But it's reported that this day in 1845, Mr. Lloyd, in a state of either extreme drunkenness or paranoia, plucked a sculpture from display, and with backers guiding his arm, threw it into a nearby glass cabinet. He was arrested, and after refusing to pay the £3 fine, was instead jailed for 2 months. Eventually, an anonymous patron would pay the fine, and William Lloyd, who had been discovered to actually be an alias for William Mackay from Trinity College, Dublin, was set free. While the sculpture seemingly survived, the glass cabinet wasn't as lucky. Nor was what it contained. A Roman cameo glass vase, dating from somewhere between 1 to 25 AD. The owner of the vase didn't want to press charges against William, stating the event was an act of folly or madness which they could not control, although an anonymous letter to the newspaper did call for the public flagellation of young William. Regardless of which sentiment the public followed, it still left the museum short one vase. Not just any vase either. This Roman cameo glass vase was thought to be one of the best examples of this particular style, a double-dipped, hand-blown vase with the outer layer carefully chipped and chiselled off to display a cameo, or raised image, thought to have been achieved by a master gem engraver, a technique so difficult that a 19th century competition to duplicate this style took the eventual winner 3 years of work to achieve. All this left the British Museum with just 2 options. Sweep the pieces up and put them away in some drawer to be forgotten, or attempt to carefully piece back together the 200+ shattered pieces. Opting for the Humpty Dumpty approach, the feat was attempted by restorer John Doubleday, and, despite not being able to fit back 37 tiny fragments, his concluded restoration was near perfect. Well, perfect until over 100 years later, when in 1948 the technique used to restore the vase was beginning to wear out. A new restoration was attempted and completed in 1949, but this one only lasted until 1988, when a third restoration was required. New epoxies and resins were tested, looking specifically for ones that would stand a test of time, and it's hoped this most recent restoration will last for well over a century. A perfect song for this story is one from David Bowie, with the lyrics, "Baby, I've been breaking glass in your room again." The song, Breaking Glass, is quite fitting for the act of vandalism committed by William. Saturday, February 8th. On this day, not year, the folk of Devon, England, were early to bed. Snow was falling heavily that evening, and it wasn't a night for being outside. The year was 1855, and while the idea of the frost fairs and the little ice age was some 40 years gone, there was still a harsh chill to the air. Yet, when they awoke the next day, footprints were found in the fresh snow. Someone had been out walking last night, in the wind and the snow and the rain. Someone. Or something. As when these footprints were examined, they didn't appear to be from a human at all, and the path they had taken nearly didn't seem possible. One moment leading up to a dead end, the next starting from behind it, over rooftops and across obstacles that should be impassable. A letter sent to the Exeter and Plymouth Gazette reads, "The return of daylight revealed the ramblings of some most busy and mysterious animal, endowed with the power of ubiquity, as its footprints were to be seen in all sorts of unaccountable places, on the tops of houses, narrow walls, in gardens and courtyards, enclosed by high walls and palings, as well as in the open fields." Continuing, "The impression of the foot closely resembles that of a donkey's shoe, and measures from 1.5 inches to, in some cases, 2.5 inches across, here and there appearing as if the foot was cleft, but in the generality of its steps the impression of the shoe was continuous and perfect." The letter concludes, "Everyone is wondering, but no one is able to explain the mystery. The poor are full of superstition, and consider it little short of a visit from old Satan, or some of his imps." Thus began the mystery known today as the Devil's Footprints. Many theories and explanations have been put forward to explain the prints, but none quite cover all the eccentricities of the footprints. Perhaps the simplest answer is that these footprints look like they were left by a cloven foot because they were. Animals, loose throughout the night, wandering around, taking shelter from the weather and walking away again after. Historian Mike Dash suggests this in an article he wrote covering the event, but also concludes that animals can't account for all the reported prints, especially with the location of some. A more unusual suspect can be found listed in an article sent to an 1855 Sydney publication, the Bell's Life in Sydney and Sporting Review, which stated, "Sunday last, the Reverend Mr. Musgrave alluded to the subject in his sermon and suggested the possibility of the footprints being those of a kangaroo," with the story going that a couple of kangaroos had escaped from a private collection a local had, although the mentioned Reverend Musgrave wasn't a believer in that answer either, stating of the kangaroos, "I certainly did not pin my faith to that version of the mystery, but the state of the public mind in the villages, dreading to go out after sunset, under the conviction that this was the devil's work, rendered it very desirable that a turn should be given to such a degraded and vitiated notion, and I was thankful that a kangaroo served to disperse ideas so derogatory." So, if wildlife and kangaroos have been ruled out, what else may have left such marks in the snow along such an impossible route? Well, one theory is that of an experimental balloon, tearing away from the dockyard in the storm and dragging a chain in its mooring below it, making a mark in the snow every time it touched down, before the wind carried it to the next piece of fresh snow to mark. The theory goes that the owners of said balloon didn't want to own up to it, as it also may have been responsible for a series of destroyed buildings and windows along its path. Of course, another possibility does exist too, that cold night in Devon, Satan did walk the earth, creeping up to peer in windows, listen at doors, look down chimneys, before ultimately vanishing as dawn broke. Nah. I'd like to give you a conclusion to this story, but even to this day, 170 years later, we just don't know what happened on that night back in 1855. Perhaps most fitting to cap off this story is the song The Devil's Footprint, a musical retelling of the story by British heavy metal band Saxon. And to end the week and the episode, a quick story for Sunday, February 9th. On this day, not year, police in Kano, Nigeria, smashed nearly 4 million bottles of beer. No, these weren't heroic frat boy cops smashing back beer after beer in the drinking sense for the most legendary day drinking event ever. These beers were literally smashed with a bulldozer, then set on fire for good measure. This 2022 story of 4 million destroyed bottles of beer is nearly double that than one from 2020, when only 1.9 million bottles of beer had been confiscated and destroyed. You see, Nigeria is a predominantly Muslim state, and drinking alcohol is haram, or not allowed by Islamic law. Despite the illegal nature of the stuff, this hasn't stopped everyone from drinking. A 2015 BBC News article titled "Secret Nigerian Drinking Dens in Kano" details that, despite the ban, after dark many people still seek out secret bars that stock and sell the stuff. Although, just like with American speakeasies of the Prohibition era, sometimes people are still caught drinking. The punishment of choice? Humiliation. As per the BBC article, when you are caught, you are shown on the TV. Look at this person. He's the son of this. He's the grandfather of this. Some late-breaking updates to this story too. I was just about to sit down and record, but checked Instagram first, and saw a post from, well, not the most reputable source, Lad Bible. But it was a post about Nigeria's favourite beer. Any guesses? Let's see how you've done. Nigeria consistently ranks within the top spot for Guinness consumption, even having been one of the few places outside of Ireland allowed to brew the stuff, with their own factory in 1962. Like I said, a quick story to end on. As for a song, 99 bottles of beer on the wall may be too obvious. So instead, let's turn back to the Blues Brothers, this time with Hey Bartender. And with that, another week and another episode of TDNY, This Day Not Year, comes to a close. That's a brief look at some of the history of the week ahead, but don't let that stop you from checking out past episodes if you haven't already. Just because a previous story doesn't match a coming date, doesn't make it any less relevant or interesting. As usual, any glaring errors, feedback, or spam, send on through to thisdaynotyear@gmail.com. And I'll see you all next week as we take a look ahead to the past and cover stories from the 10th to the 16th of February. Until then.